Hello, and welcome to another episode. These 2 weeks weren't as productive as I would have hoped, and I'm going to get into why I think that was and what I'm going to do to mitigate that in future sprints. But this first week of the sprint, I did get a couple really cool features implemented that I'm excited to show you. So without further ado, let's hop in and see what I got done. Alright, so as always, we got to start with the Trello board. So here are the 3 things that I got done these couple weeks. Not too much, but important features. First of all, we got the character animation system done, and then seamless scene transitions. So if you may remember correctly in the last devlog, we just had characters moving around, so the player would walk around, but it was just one image, one sprite, if you will, moving around. There wasn't actual animation for the character moving left or right or down or up. And that's what we implemented this first week, as well as the seamless scene transition, which I'll get into next. But first of all, if we go over to Unity and hit play, you'll notice that though it looks very similar as it did before, this time the character has a walking animation and can walk any direction I want them to go. This is doable within the Unity ecosystem, but not exactly what I wanted it to be. So if we come over to this animator tab right here, you'll see that Unity already has built in a graph-like system that allows us to be able to have different animation states. So I've created this animation state walk down, up, left, right, and then idle positions of like standing, looking straight up or down and such. And Unity allows you to connect these different animations, have them flow between each other. But after reading a comment I saw in one of my Discords, I noticed that this graph right here is really best used for 3D animation development because it allows you to interpolate between the animations that are happening in the game, which isn't really what I need. It overcomplicates things, and all of this I can do within code. So as you can see, none of these animation states are connected to each other. I just have them sitting here so I can tell through code when one needs to fire off and when another one needs to fire off. So basically, what's going on is when I press down on the keyboard, for instance, through code, I'm telling the game, okay, so the character's walking down. I'll show you, actually. The character is walking downwards, so go ahead and play this animation. So if we go over to the player movement script, this is very similar to what we've seen in previous devlogs where I made a really simple movement, but instead of simply just moving the character based on the X-Y axis, the horizontal and vertical axes that I've talked about previously, we're also getting a reference to this animation controller, and then we're setting the current animation based on the X and Y positions. Now, this is fairly straightforward. It might sound complicated if you've never done it before, but it's fairly straightforward. If the person's pressing sideways, swap to the animation that shows the character walking sideways. But there's a catch that took this a little longer than you might expect. So if I pull up Sprite, which is the piece of software that I use to create the pixel art and the animations, we have a couple examples of 2 different animation sprite sheets that I have in the game. So this top one is the character walking down, and most of these pictures may look very similar, but they're slightly different as the character is walking. And then these are the different images that are used in the animation for the character walking to the right. Most of them look very similar, and so you wouldn't notice a huge difference between them. However, there's a noticeable difference, which is this frame right here. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The 9th frame in the animation sequence, where the character blinks. And in the 9th frame, on this one, they blink as well. I have it for every 9th frame the character blinks, just to have it consistently the character is blinking. And the important thing to notice is it is actually very noticeable in the game when the character does this. Why is this important? Well, how the code works is when the animation is told to play, it starts from frame 1 and it goes through all the frames, and when it gets to the last frame, it goes back to frame 1. However, let's say it's going through the frames and looping through the frames as I'm walking down, and when I get to this frame, the player presses the right key on the keyboard, and we go to the animation for the character walking to the right. So it's going to start right back at the beginning of the animation and play from there. So I had to make sure that in my code, it got a reference to the current frame in the animation and started back up here instead of at the beginning or wherever the animation is, so that the character would never be in a position of not blinking at all. As we get to this frame, we start over here, and then we get to this frame, and then we push it another direction and start over, where the character's never blinking, but we have consistency throughout the frames. This may seem like a really small detail for something like blinking, but it can become much more significant if we've got more complex animations that the characters have, where an inconsistency and a lack of repetition throughout the animations as they change from one to the other could be a lot more noticeable. So if we go back to Unity, you can see this playing out. If I hit play, and if I start walking the character around, you'll notice that he blinks, and then he blinks again in a consistent way. But then if I press sideways, he's going to continue blinking at that consistent rate, regardless of what I do, regardless of what direction I'm pressing. And this is going to be big, again, when I'm dealing with things that are much bigger than just blinking. Okay, so the second thing that I worked on this first week was the seamless scene transitions component or feature to the game. So this game is an open world game. There aren't really different scenes. It's supposed to all flow together. But in the real world, we do have this concept of scene transitions. For instance, if you walk into a building, you're no longer outside. The smells, the feeling, what you can see, what you can process changes drastically. You are now an inside environment and your scene has changed. So I want to be able to replicate this within the video game world. Seamless, so that just like when you walk into a building, there's no loading screen or the screen goes dark in real world. I don't want any of that, but still a scene transition where you experience a difference in environment. So if we come back into Unity, I'll show you what I have so far, and this will be changed later on. So we've got our building right here, just like we've had before, and it's got collision. I can't walk into it. I can't, but you can see we've got Y sorting where I'm behind it when I'm up there, and then I'm in front of it when I'm below it. But then also, if I go through the front door, now I can actually walk into the building, the roof disappears in an unobtrusive way, and I'm now in the building. And if I walk out, it comes back in. This was actually fairly complicated. I know I've talked about Y sorting and how Unity makes it easy, where when an image is below another image, it looks like it's in front, or if it's above, it looks like it's behind. But that becomes a lot more tricky when you've got an image inside of another image, where I need to be behind this front wall and in front of this back wall. And it makes it even more complicated when I'm fading in and out of certain images. So ultimately, to cut a long story short, because I don't have much time in this devlog, I basically broke this object into 5 different pieces. So we've got the inside, we've got the wall for the inside, we've got the roof, we've got the front for the outside, and then we've got the door, or the doors. And these components are going to be basically, for any object, are going to have these 5 components, and I'm simply just fading in and out of these different components when you're inside versus when you're outside. And there's just a little collision or trigger that I've set up, this green box, that lets me know when the character has entered into the building or when the character has left the building. I fade in when the character has left the building. I fade out when the character has entered. This is going to be agnostic for any building, so I basically just have to have this empty object, connect all the pieces together, put on the collisions and triggers, and I'm good to go. And it should work with anything and everything. This isn't complete yet, though, because as you can see, when my character is outside of the building, they're not aware of what's going on inside. But if I come in here, well, now they can see what's inside and outside. That's not very realistic. It doesn't give them the proper perspective of a limited understanding of their surroundings. And I'm going to work on that in the future, probably fading out the background when they're in a building, just like I fade in the roof when they're outside of the building. But that's going to be for a future devlog. Alright, so week 2, I spent all of my time art experimenting, which in this case simply means I was working on the character models that I have implemented in the game. If you'll remember a little while back, I said that the artwork that I have in the game currently is completely stand-in. It will not be implemented in the final game. And so right now I really wanted to get my hands dirty with trying to update what I have out there to be something that I would actually be happy to see in the final product. And so I'm going to show you my process for that I spent in this past week. So here it is. Here's the old model that I was using for the main character in the game. Completely stand-in, obviously. The shirt doesn't make any sense for a medieval or fantasy style game. But it was artwork that I already had. And I wanted to take something like this and update it for what I really want to see in the final game. So to do that, I'll show you a graphic that I had as I went through my process. So these are the kind of models that I was working with, and I like the general feel of it. I like the head size and everything, but I really wanted to play around with it and see what I could get going. So what I did is I created this head shape that I really liked, and then I just started drawing arms and legs on that. And I really wasn't going in any direction with this. I'm not super comfortable with creating characters, and so I wasn't just able to rely on pure skill or anything, talent, to get what I was going at. So just trying things, seeing what worked, what didn't work, and be able to gauge after the fact if I liked it or not helped a whole lot. So I just drew strokes for an arm, drew a stroke for a leg, till I got something that seemed generally okay, and then I did the same thing, and if it didn't work, I would just erase it and do it again until I had something that was generally okay. Then I would do something that was slightly different. This character is smaller than the previous ones. And then I just did this for, 7 times, until I got a good list of stuff that I liked. Put it down, walked away, went to bed, got up the next morning, and then demoed these to friends and family. I showed these to a bunch of my family members, and then I went to my game development Discord and showed them to those people. And ultimately what the consensus was number 3, this guy right here, was the best of the options I had. So I took this original model, cleaned it up, separated the artwork out a bit so that I liked it a bit more, changed the size of things, and then played around with what it would look like as a character. And so I took this color palette, projected on the character. I changed a few more things. It's kind of hard to tell from this perspective, but this character is a bit shorter. The eyes are smaller and lower down on the head. I played around with putting hair on, adding shading. And then finally, when I had something that I really liked, based on suggestions people had given me and my experimentation above, I ultimately projected it onto the color palettes and characters I had at the beginning, ultimately leaving me with these still stand-in because they're not wearing outfits for fantasy or medieval, but these good final products of what I want the characters to look like. And so that's kind of how I went from these things, these characters, to something that's a bit more proper in the perspective, something that feels a little bit more professional. I don't know if this is the style I'm ultimately going to go with in the final product. We've still got a ways before we get to there, but it is something that I would be happy with if it were in the final product. I know my style is going to change and my experience is going to increase, but I am satisfied with what I got right here. Now, as I mentioned before, I wasn't nearly as productive this sprint as I have in the past, and I think I know why. See, the problem was, in the past, I was working on all of these technical problems that I needed to solve. I knew exactly what I needed to do with player movement controller, and I was able to just dive in and work on the problem. This first week was productive. I was able to get a couple main components done, but when it came to the artwork, even though I am, to a good extent, an artist, I still have a hard time being able to break that down into bite-sized pieces and understand exactly what I'm getting into. Basically, I was overwhelmed by this extremely general ticket of art experimenting, and I was having a hard time finding motivation to dive into something as vague as that. And so over here, you'll see that I've added a bunch of new tickets, many of them art-related, with a lot more specific things that I need to work on, such as a basic town house model or basic character sprite sheet, or implementing ground tiling or update ground texture. Something I can understand, I can break down into small pieces, I can pull into a sprint, and I can feel motivated to work on it. That's how I'm going to address any problems that I have with feeling burned out or overwhelmed with art in the future, and hopefully it will mean that I'm able to take on a lot more work in sprints that are art-focused, as this one was. And so that brings us to the end of another sprint. Upcoming in the next sprint, I intend for it to be another mixture between art and implementation. One big feature I want to implement in the next one is doors. This may seem like a simple problem, but it's actually quite a complicated problem that I'm excited to dive into in the next 2 weeks. I'm also going to flesh out the character models and maybe work on some of those other art components I just talked about. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this, leave it a like, and I'll see you in the next one.